Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Many may question the very existence of God, and if they do believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, many question if God, who once blessed this nation, birthed on Judeo-Christian values, has withdrawn his special blessing for the United States. History shows that in troubled times such as the Civil War, the assassinations of the 60s, and even in today's divisive America, God's hand is still on America. Our next guest brings new insights that demonstrate the miraculous provisions for this nation, using our nation's past and some of the more obscure examples of his divine providence that has shaped the very blessing that this nation has and continues to enjoy. Michael Medved's daily 3-hour radio show reaches more than 5 million listeners on more than 300 stations coast to coast. He's the author of 12 other books, including a number of New York Times bestsellers. He's a member of USA Today's Board of Contributors, a former chief film critic of the New York Post, and for more than a decade co-hosted Sneak Previews, the weekly movie review on PBS. An honors graduate of Yale with departmental honors in American history, he lives with his family in Seattle, Washington. Here to talk about his new book, God's Hand on America, Divine Providence in the Modern Era, is Michael Medved. Michael, it's an honor and a privilege to have you on our show today.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's great to speak with you.
In your prior best-selling book, The American Miracle, you chronicle God's hand on the founding fathers as well as other events. I think 12 you recounted in that book in our early history, and established that many of these events could not be mere coincidence, but a demonstration of God's sovereign power and role in American history. Is this book a sequel to that book?
Well, sure. I'll tell you exactly how it came about. Is originally when I was doing American Miracle, it was beginning to look, it's a 400-page book, and it covers American history from the Pilgrims from 1620 up until Lincoln's assassination in 1865, asking a question: how could a sovereign God, who Lincoln passionately believed in, and believed in God's role in history and in shaping our history, how could God have taken such an instrumental figure? And Lincoln often used the term, describing himself as an instrument of the divine will. And the new book picks up right on the same night as Lincoln's assassination, which involved the attempted assassination of somebody else, Secretary of State William Henry Seward. And so we follow that because truly the story of Seward, which leads directly to victory in the Cold War, which is part of the story that I think people need to know, that launches this question of the continued and somewhat less striking involvement of the divine. And what I mean by that, Eric, is that what you're really dealing with here is, in the first years of the Republic, America was so unexpected, it's so against logic. No one could have predicted that this great power would have originated in North America. But in subsequent events, it's tougher because America is already a successful, powerful nation. And yet, when you look at this pattern of happy accidents, one of the points that I make, and I think it's a very, very important point, is that if you have a pattern of happy accidents, it's still a pattern. It's evidence of intelligent design and not random evolution.
In this new book, God's Hand on America, you chronicle 10 events demonstrating divine providence. In each story, you share of an almost supernatural intervention that changed the course of history. Do you believe that our destiny as a nation is predetermined, even when so many now reject the notion of a divine design or a power greater than man himself?
Well, there is a power greater than man himself, but As you know, in Jewish tradition, we believe in Bechirat Chofshit, in free will, that people are enabled to interact with God. What I do think is predetermined is the instrumentality of the United States, that the United States receives divine blessing not as reward, but as a means to impact God's role in history. The last full chapter in God's Hand on America is about Dr. King. And Dr. King very famously said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In other words, the United States has been used as an instrument, as a tool for helping the uplift of all of humanity and helping us all have the opportunity to choose richer and better and more beneficial lives. And the fact that most Americans have made those appropriate choices, I still think that's the case. It's a good country, and it's an enormously important country. And if you believe that God has any role in history at all, what other country would he choose? He's not going to choose Belgium. It's going to be the United States of America.
It's interesting that one of the most impactful experiences of your life was being 20 feet away from Bobby Kennedy when he was assassinated in 1968. And you've been quoted many times as saying that traumatic event shaped your life more than any other significant event. Here we are 51 years later, and the landscape has changed, but you were there bearing witness to one of the first Islamic radical attacks in the form of Sirhan Sirhan. As you look back in retrospect, in light of today's alarming rate of Islamic influenced terror attacks around here in the world, and you reflect back on that particular instance, how have you, your view, your vision, your understanding, and really seeing that you saw the tip of the genesis of what was going to come and is being fulfilled now even today?
Well, it's a complicated question. I wrote more extensively about my own experience and my own political and spiritual and personal transitions in my book Right Turns. First of all, and this I think is important for people to remember, Sirhan Sirhan, most people don't even know that he is honored right now by the authorities in the Palestinian territories. There are two different schools that are named after him. There are public squares that are named after him. The murderer of Robert Kennedy is viewed as a hero by Islamist Nazi advocates in the Palestinian world. The irony is that Sirhan's background was not Muslim. It's Christian, and or so-called Christian, but obviously he had long abandoned that in this fever of Palestinian nationalism in which he lived in 1968. Here's another important thing, Eric, and I think it's really crucial for people to know the history, is what he was reacting to in killing Robert Francis Kennedy was a debate that had been held literally days before, in June of 1968, during the Democratic primary for President of the United States. And the primary was between Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota and Senator Robert Kennedy of New York. And what they were arguing about was the question of selling phantom jets to Israel. Now, that was very controversial then, because the United States did not provide aircraft to Israel. The aircraft that Israel used to win the 1967 war as I'm sure you know, were French.
Yes.
They were mirages. We did not have, Israel did not have American planes or American assistance. And that came later. And part of what I try to do in God's Hand on America is to refute some of this idea that, well, basically, the reason that the United States is involved in the Middle East is because of Jewish influence or some kind of malevolent conspiracy here in America. Because the truth is, and there's a central chapter in this book, that our founding fathers, and before the founding fathers, even the Puritans who set up the Pilgrim experience, the Puritan experience in Massachusetts Bay and all of New England, saw themselves as purposefully attempting to fulfill what is specified in Genesis 12:3, which is those who bless the Jewish people will be blessed, those who curse the Jewish people will be cursed. What's fascinating to me is that people believe that before there was any Jewish population to speak of in the United States. And at the time of the first census in 1790, there were 2,800 Jewish people who were reported in the country, and it was a nation of 3 million. So you're talking about less than 1/10 of 1% of the population. And yet, there were early Americans, I quote John Adams in my book, who anticipated he says, an army of more than 100,000 Israelites coming to liberate, and he doesn't say Palestine, he says Judea. And he wrote that letter in 1819.
You know, it's fascinating that one of your chapters in the book, where you talk about the history of Jewish influence in America, started long before the events which culminated in a tidal wave of Russian Jewish immigration beginning in 1981, coinciding with America's success and rise to world power. And it does tie back to that, and I believe it ties back to that, the Abrahamic blessing and our alignment with Israel. So this is as personal to me as it is to you, as our families emigrated here from the shtetls and the pogroms of a rising sentiment in Eastern and Western Europe against our people. I kind of have a two-part question for you. Do you see America's role in support of Israel with the rise of anti-Semitism continuing after this current administration? Because we've had, I think that Harry Truman was really the Cyrus, if you would, in playing the part in recognizing Israel. You had Nixon, whose mother was really the inspiration behind his support to answer the call to send support to Israel. And then you have the current administration, which has recognized Israel, that has acknowledged Jerusalem and just passed that we are not just a religious group, but we are a nation, something that God has called us out in Scripture as a nation. So with the rise of anti-Semitism, as you and I have seen across America and across the globe, it seems to be more and more desecration of synagogues and cemeteries and more rhetoric aimed against. Although we've had a long history of it, we're not immune to it, but there's a possibility that in 4 more years there may be a change. If this current administration continues 4 more years after that, based on trending, you know, back to back, we don't know. But how do you see that? Do you see America taking that turn? There's that great socialistic outcry today in America, which is really, in some ways, an anti-Israel agenda in the narrative, when they're pinned down to ask about it, they're critical on the Democratic side of Donald Trump's position and close-knit relationship with Netanyahu and with Israel.
Well, look, I think your concern is absolutely appropriate. And one of the things that I know Israelis care about most, and people like my brother made Aliyah 30 years ago, and he's very prominent in Israeli affairs. My four nieces and I have one niece and three nephews. The three nephews and the niece have all done their service in the IDF and the Israel Defense Forces. And so my brother has skin in the game, and he will tell you the most important thing that Israelis worry about is Israel becoming a partisan issue. And that's part of why I wrote God's Hand on America, and the two chapters about the involvement of Jewish immigration and shaping American philo-Semitic, not anti-Semitic attitudes that have always characterized our country. What's important about that is it's never partisan, and it shouldn't be partisan. And identifying one party or another as the pro-Israel party is simply wrong. I know that Democrats have tried that for years, tried to say, well, those Republicans, they're anti-Semites, Jews aren't welcome there in the Republican Party. The truth is, one of the things I found out, Eric, is that Senator Robert Taft, who was known as Mr. Republican, and ran for president and won the nomination in 1952, Robert Taft was one of the most outspoken Zionists in the United States Congress. He was the only member of the U.S. Senate who actually called for American military intervention during Israel's war for independence. Truman didn't. And again, the idea that pro-Israel identification and priorities should be associated with one party or another rather than with an American point of view, I think is dangerous. And I do hope that with all of the partisan passions we have right now in the United States, that regarding that issue, we'd be able to surmount them. And I honestly think we will. Again, one of the things that amazed me in doing this book was just how pervasive this sense that part of America's destiny, part of its purpose, involved actually the rebirth of the people of Israel and the state of Israel. I write extensively in the book about the first consul general to Jerusalem that this country dispatched in 1840, when Jerusalem was a village of about 15,000 people, a plurality of whom, by the way, were Jewish, in the Ottoman Empire. And his name was Warder Cresson, and he was a Philadelphia Quaker who had dabbled in a great variety of religions. He actually became an early Mormon. Then he left the Mormon church, became a Shaker, which didn't work for him. He eventually had 6 children, and Shakers believed in permanent celibacy. But in any event, Warder Cresson was dispatched to Jerusalem in 1840. He landed carrying a dove of peace in a cage and waving an American flag. And he was convinced that it was no accident that the American symbol was the eagle, and that there are, as you very well know, so many biblical prophecies about the Jewish people coming back on wings of eagles. He thought his role as an American was to facilitate the return, and this is 50 years before Herzl. And Cresson, later in his life, established really the first kibbutz, the first scientific farm, where he would hope that he would help to lead Jewish people to come back to become farmers again and using scientific techniques in farming. The land that he bought for that purpose is today Emek Rephaim, which is a very nice neighborhood of Jerusalem, which happens to be where my brother lives. In any event, what I record in the book is Cressen's debate with Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, who came to Jerusalem. He was looking to find himself after his novel got a very disappointing reception in 1857. In any event, Melville believed that Israel would never be reborn, that the Jewish people were a dead people, that this and he believed that America had to be the new Israel. And Cresson made the argument that no, Israel would inevitably be reborn, and that America's most important role and most unifying role at a time of American division on the eve of the Civil War would be in support of Israel. In any event, Warder Cresson won that argument very obviously. If you look around and you see today the flourishing and dynamic and vibrant nation of Israel.
You know, not to dwell on this being a singular subject within the book, but this is the one part of the book which is both historical and forward-moving. The other events, the other 9 historical events happened and are recorded and expounded upon in the book, but this one is one that has the next chapter to it, which has not been written. And because of that, I wanted to spend the early part of the interview with you talking about that. So the question becomes then is that you know where we are today. What do you see as a consequence to America if we do not continue in this path of support of the State of Israel? Was the Obama administration and the economic fallout of the years of his office, were they somehow impacted by his disdain or lack of overt support for Israel? And we see now a period of prosperity in a White House and an overarching view of Israeli support as being indicative that if we don't continue, there's a consequence, and if we do continue, there's a blessing. What do you see as a consequence of America if we don't continue in the path of support for Israel?
Again, when you talk about continuing in a path of support for Israel, I know this is in a very political season when we're coming up to a presidential election, where we're in the midst of a ridiculous impeachment crisis, which I think is travesty, and I wish that weren't happening. There's a great tendency in American politics to view people that you don't like and that you oppose as more destructive and cataclysmic than they really are, and at the same time to hail people who you admire and support as more messianic and more utterly wonderful and decisive than they really are. Otto von Bismarck, the German Eisenkanzler, the Iron Chancellor, once said something I think tremendously important, that it is the job of the statesman to listen for God's footsteps in history and then to grab his coattails and hang on. In other words, it's to recognize the direction that God is trying to steer our world and to try to assist the Almighty in that effort rather than to resist that particular direction. And now, having said that, I think it's tough. I think it's reductive and far more complex than that to say that America is rewarded for good behavior. I think America has been selected the same way that uh, the the Jewish people were for God's purposes. And at no point in the Bible, as you know, does it say that the Jewish people were selected because they were better than other people. I think at no point was America selected to fulfill God's purpose because we were better than other people. It is the idea of being a divine instrument is trying to be worthy of that instrumentality, trying to fulfill God's will. I talk in my book, there's an encounter that Lincoln had in the middle of the Civil War, uh, where he says, well, we will prevail, Mr. President, because we are on God's side. And President Lincoln reportedly said, I am far more concerned because God is on our side. And Lincoln said, I am far more concerned that we should be on God's side. And that should be what Americans attempt to do, not because we'll be rewarded for it, but because doing God's will provides its own reward.
Well, as he says very clearly, the obedience is better than sacrifice. He wants to follow his lead, and those that say God is my co-pilot, I don't want to ride with them. I'd rather have God as the pilot. We're talking with Michael Medved, New York Times bestseller, a phenomenal talk radio host, heard on over 300 channels, stations around the United States, over 5 million listeners, well known for his deep historical views and prose in the area of revelation of truth. And he does the same in his new book, God's Hand on America, Divine Providence in the Modern Era, containing 10 very unusual stories, one which we spent the first part on, talking about this large wave of Russian immigration being tied to the success of America. But there are other fascinating stories contained within, and after we take this short break, we're going to dig into a little bit more on that story of Seward's Folly. We'll talk a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt, the Battle of Midway, and maybe a little bit more about FDR and Harry Truman, and what's next as we look at history to be a harbinger of what we, if we don't study it, if we don't learn about it, we're prone to repeat it again. What are some of the warnings and messages and lessons to be harvested from these incredibly interesting and very well researched stories? We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan, in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Michael Medved, author of the newly released book, God's Hand on America, A Divine Providence in the Modern Era. Michael, welcome back to this segment. And you can find more about all things Medved at michaelmedved.com. And it is, I will tell you, it is a whirling dervish of a website. You can find almost anything, and even things about his ability to pass a driving examination, and the story about a rambler. And Michael, I do my research, and like I said, I've been looking forward to this since your publisher came to me and said, would I have you on the program? You chronicle 10 specific stories within the book. In your first book, in this, The American Miracle, there were 12. These are an additional 10. And you kind of pick up in some way where you left off with the story of Abraham Lincoln, the Secretary of State, and that event and how God's providential hand was on that. And it happens to also play into a role of us expanding as a nation, adding an additional state to it that put us in the closest proximity to Russia and gave us a strategic advantage, not just a folly as most people viewed it at that time.
The one point that I make, and it was something that was new to me in actually researching this, is that if we are to believe President Putin of Russia, then we won the Cold War on the night of Lincoln's assassination. Now this takes a moment of explanation, because that's a provocative, deliberately provocative and radical statement. But Putin, in 2017, was the 150th anniversary of America purchasing Alaska. And Alaska used to be known as Russian America. The term Alaska was only given to it by Senator Charles Sumner during the debates trying to ratify the treaty in which we purchased this Russian America. In any event, Vladimir Putin, with historians and poets and others, commemorated the 150th anniversary of the sale of Alaska by saying that had not the Tsar been persuaded to do that, to sell that to America, the Russian Empire would still exist. They would have won the Cold War. They talked about, imagine if we had had missiles not just in Cuba, but in Cuba and in Juneau, Alaska. In any event, all of that was made possible because on the night of Lincoln's assassination, April 14th, 1865, William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State, survived a very serious assassination attempt on himself. an assassin broke into his home, part of the Booth conspiracy. His name was Lewis Powell, 6'5" Confederate veteran. And with a 4-inch bladed knife, took the knife and brought it down towards Seward's jugular at least 4 times. Some sources say 7 times. And yet he survived. How? Because he had had a carriage accident 9 days before. 9 days before, and he was wearing, because he had broken his jaw, a steel contraption that covered his lower jaw and his neck with bandages around it. And that protected him from the assassin's knife. And Seward himself defied all logic, and at a time when a president was wrapped up in a impeachment crisis, Andrew Johnson, Seward personally pursued what he was derided for doing initially, which is the purchase of Alaska, which we find out years later was utterly crucial in determining the United States prevailing in this war against the evil empire. And I think President Reagan was absolutely right to call Russia the evil empire. Something else Seward did, and that he survived to do, was during the midst of his negotiations about Alaska, he had a paper come across his desk, and he decided on his own initiative, without any consultation with the President of the United States, Secretary of State authorized America claiming possession of a tiny little island atoll, which was 2.4 square miles total. Nobody lived there. They were islands that were taken under the provisions of the Guano Islands Act because they had bird poop on them that was valuable fertilizer. In any event, it was Midway Island. It was the Midway Atoll, which later became the subject for the decisive battle of World War II, the one that determined that, yes, the United States would prevail against the Japanese Empire, which, by the way, in the first 6 months of our involvement in the war, the Japanese had won virtually everything. Midway turned it away in a battle that even participants on the Japanese side saw as miraculous in its outcome for America.
You know, in that same line, looking at the Battle of Midway, as you examine a continuation into almost a seamless set of prophetic consequential events which were divinely orchestrated, one not having a vision of the next, and in the midst of the event not having any connection to its history until someone like yourself comes along and links together and connects the dots of these various events. And so we're now engaged in this war, World War II, and this Battle of Midway, and something happens, something supernatural.
Well, and it happens in 5 minutes. My chapter in the book, in God's Hand on America, that is about the Battle of Midway is called The 5-Minute Miracle. Because literally in 5 minutes, the American Navy, through, quote, accidental and unanticipated circumstances, was able to destroy the 3 greatest, largest, most formidable aircraft carriers in the world. They later destroyed, the next day, a 4th Japanese carrier. Now, the Americans were outnumbered. The Japanese had 3 times the number of planes we did. And what's fascinating is that even participants who were non-believers saw God's hand at Midway, because it was so quick and such a chance that from 3 different aircraft carriers, from the Enterprise, from the Hornet, from the Yorktown, that these 3 American squadrons who were lost over open ocean in the North Pacific, that they would find each other and then dive bomb, these dauntless dive bombers, the Japanese fleet. And it was so impressive that one of the Japanese commanders, who had been the leader of the attack on Pearl Harbor, his name was Matsuo Fushida, he's a captain in the Japanese Navy, He'd been honored personally by Emperor Hirohito, big war hero for the Japanese. He was unable to fly at Midway because he got appendicitis 2 days before the battle. And he viewed what happened there, internalized that greatly. He then survived the end of the war, spoke to some Christian prisoners who had been victimized by the Japanese, and eventually he became a Christian in 1947. And he wrote a little personal account called God's Samurai. Believe it or not, Mutsuya Fushida, from the Battle of Midway and seeing this grand illustration of God's will in history, ended up appearing 9 times with Billy Graham and in Billy Graham Crusades, and actually talking about America as a reflection of God's will to uplift all of humanity.
It's really quite extraordinary. You go on to chronicle a conspiracy by the Democratic leaders when FDR became ill, and the future White House great Harry Truman, the president of my childhood. It's just amazing that God's hand is in government, and as we look throughout the biblical narratives, it was always with the leadership. God always dealt with the head of the nations, the kings, and the people were impacted by the decisions made by the kings of how they responded to God's instruction. Our exile, Babylonian captivity in 586, is a clear example of bad leadership, bad result, and 70 years of expulsion before we could return back. You talk about a behind the scenes, what you call conspiracy of the pure of heart.
I've just got to correct you. That's not my calling it that. The participants in the conspiracy of the pure of heart, all of whom, by the way, happened to be very devout Catholics. It was a group of people led by Ed Flynn, who was a former Democratic National Chairman, who was a political boss in the Bronx, a very deeply religious guy, went to Mass every day. And he got together with a number of other people, Frank Walker, who was the Postmaster General, and a remarkable guy, another former Democratic National Chairman named Bob Hannigan, who was a former professional baseball player, remarkable guy who was sort of touted for great things. And he was the real leader of this conspiracy of the pure of heart. And what they saw is they saw a vice president of the United States who, when Roosevelt became very, very ill and visibly ill, and yet insisted on running for a 4th term in the middle of World War II in 1944, the incumbent vice president was a guy named Henry Wallace, who the people in the conspiracy of the pure of heart were very concerned because he was not only sympathetic to Stalin, he had praised Stalin and the Russian Revolution and saw the atheist and anti-religious, and by the way, profoundly anti-Christian nature of the Russian Revolution, saw that as a liberating force in mankind. And the prospect of Henry Wallace becoming president was terrifying. He was also, by the way, involved in, and I didn't know this until researching God's Hand on America, he was involved in very weird guru cult religiosity based on theosophy and Madame Blavatsky, and following a really malevolent Russian guru named Nicholas Roerich, who I write about in the book. In any event, they launched this conspiracy to make a replacement for the sitting vice president, who was very popular. And it's an amazing story of how they were able to accomplish it. Here's the amazing thing, is that after they succeeded, and Bob Hannigan, who was from St. Louis, Missouri, chose a very obscure at the time Missouri senator named Harry Truman to replace Vice President Wallace. And obviously that was a very fateful, very appropriate choice. He said after they succeeded, and Truman was inaugurated as vice president, he said, "When I die, I want on my tombstone that here lies the man who prevented Henry Wallace from becoming president of the United States." The irony is, Bob Hannigan died shortly thereafter. It was this was his purpose in life, and what a profound purpose it was. You made a reference before, Eric. Harry Truman grew up, and he talks about this, and he talks about this in his own memoirs. He grew up going to Baptist camp, summer camp, where they would sing about the Jewish people returning to Israel, and that it was prophesied and it was God's work and God's. And after he had left the presidency in 1953, Truman had a speech before the United Jewish Appeal in New York, and he was introduced by saying, "And here's President Truman, who was one of the most important people in bringing our reborn state of Israel into existence." And he turned to the fellow who had introduced him, Eddie Jacobson, who was his old former business partner from Independence, Missouri. And he said, "Eddie, very nice introduction, but you got something wrong. You said, I'm one of the important people?" And he said, "I am Cyrus." And he said it twice, "I am Cyrus." So he was conscious of the biblical nature of his role in history.
It's incredible that in so many of these stories, the outcroppings of the birth of the nation of Israel out of the ashes of World War II, the part that presidents have been forced into making decisions that have charted some of the course of Israel, and of course the current state of affairs in Israel being what they are. There's many more chapters that could be devoted just to the various roles. But one of the stories that caught my eye was the Teddy Roosevelt story about the assassination attempt. And we've got about 4.5 minutes left, so I'd like you to regale us with that story.
Well, sure. Actually, the longest chapter in the book is the chapter about Theodore Roosevelt. And one of the many things that people find out is he thoroughly despised it when people called him Teddy. When he was a little boy, and a very weak little boy who was not expected to live because he had a whole range of childhood diseases, his family nickname was Teddy, not Teddy, Teddy. He hated it. He always insisted people call him Theodore. So Theodore Roosevelt dueled death all his life, going back to his childhood, being involved in the Battle of San Juan Hill, which is extraordinary. He was the only figure on horseback in that charge uphill. And there were more than 80 people right around him who were felled by bullets and either killed or severely wounded. He was untouched. In any event, in 1912, when he was running to come back as president, as a Bull Moose candidate, progressive independent candidate for president, he was getting ready to give a long speech in Milwaukee in October of 1912, when a crazed individual who believed in his dreams that God had commanded him to kill Theodore Roosevelt shot Roosevelt from about 10 feet away. The bullet went directly into his chest, and it was stopped by the folded up speech, which was very long. It was 50 pages. So it was folded up, and it was in his coat pocket and his glasses case. And it was slowed, not stopped. It went into his heart, toward his heart, about an inch away. It stopped. And he's bleeding profusely, and he insisted on finishing this speech, the most dramatic single speech in American political history. And one of the things that Roosevelt always questioned was, okay, why did God spare me? And he came to believe, 2 years later when World War I started, that his purpose in life was American preparedness. Because at the time that Roosevelt began this campaign, America had an army that was actually smaller than Portugal's. We did not have a substantial military resource. This has been um, basically ignored under his successors, President Taft and then President Wilson. And so this campaign for preparedness, Roosevelt led very directly and felt that that was his purpose. In any event, what's fascinating is that when he died in 1919, the Vice President of the United States, Thomas Marshall, said, it's a good thing that he died in his sleep, because if he had been awake and death had come for him, there would have been a fight. Well, there was a fight. He fought against death all his life. And basically, in that struggle, the country won.
Yeah, I think I always look at a book and ask, what is the message that the author is trying to convey? What's the takeaway after I've read this book? Is it information? Is it transformation? Is it entertainment? What is it? And I think in this case, it is exactly what it says it is. It chronicles God's hand on America, how there's been divine providence in the modern era. You and I have been alive for over 25% of America's history, and therefore, when you take a look at that, you realize we've seen a lot happen in our lifetime. My mother is 93 years old and still plays golf twice a week and lives and she's been alive for 35% of America's history. And we're a young country, but when you take a look at what we as a country and a nation have done in the short period of time we've been in existence, it is nothing short of miraculous. And
Absolutely right. In our lifetimes, America has saved the world, because it is in our lifetime that the victory in the Cold War, which was so crucial, has happened. And if you look at the way that people live today, the choices that Americans have, and this is one thing, for people to be ungrateful is a profound sin. And it is not only a sin, but it's destructive
yes.
for personal happiness.
Well,
gratitude is obviously the key to satisfaction and success, it seems to me.
You are absolutely right, and unfortunately we've run out of time. It's been a delight to meet you, to spend this hour with you, and you have blessed us incredibly with your wit, your knowledge, your command, and your heart. And that shows in your book, it shows in your character, and we appreciate you being with us so very much. We've been talking with Michael Medved, author of the new book, God's Hand on America, Divine Providence in the Modern Era. You can get a copy of this book through our website, ignitingnation.com, or visit michaelmedved.com for all things Medved. You'll find a wealth of information, a wealth of articles, interviews, and Michael Medved is a fascinating individual with a very strong point of view and one who is quite expressive, and I find him engaging on a number of levels. So I encourage you,
thank you so much.
If you want to know more about the country you live in, or for all of our global audience all around the world, prime time in the Middle East, if you want to know more about America and our history, this is a great resource for you as well. Michael Medved, thank you profoundly for being with us.
And Godspeed to you, and happy Hanukkah, and all blessings for the season.
And for you as well, my friend. Thank you. God bless. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.